Dunny and Bop, the two snipers, had been hiding in the grass for an unknown amount of time. Only when they confirmed that the area was completely quiet did they dare to discuss their optimal escape plan. The first priority was the air route, followed by the land route, while the water route was only a last resort. Occasionally, Donnie would glance at a photo of his beautiful wife and skeptically ask Bop, "Are you sure this is a peacekeeping mission?" Neither of them was clear about the real mission because the place they were in was eerily quiet. After a long wait, reinforcements finally arrived. Their task was to protect the retreating troops, with the main objective being the insurgents chasing them. Donnie quickly assessed the wind speed, wind direction, and distance, while Bop locked onto the target. The sound of gunfire erupted, and the guards and drivers were eliminated. Everyone thought the threat had been neutralized, but suddenly, a large number of enemy troops charged forward. Bop continued to fight, nearly taking out one of them with a single shot. However, due to the overwhelming enemy numbers after Donnie identified the leader, Bop immediately finished him off with a lethal shot. The enemy, feeling pressured, began using mortars. Although they didn't know the exact positions of the snipers, they hoped to hit something by indiscriminately firing. Donnie and Bop quickly contacted command. But after witnessing the bombs explode everywhere, the commander decided to turn off the communication device and abandon them, not wanting to risk exposing the invasion plan. The enemy deployed helicopters, targeting a suspicious mountain peak and firing heavily. After evading a series of shots, the two soldiers began fighting back. Bop knew that the cowards had abandoned them, but during a fierce helicopter assault, Donnie was hit. Amid the dust and chaos, he fell and sacrificed his life on the spot. Bop didn't have time to mourn his comrade, because the helicopters would soon return. He hastily grabbed a bag and pulled out a Barrett sniper rifle. Bop started shooting 1 shot, 2 shots, 3 shots. They exchanged gunfire, and finally, Bop managed to hit the helicopter's weak spot. 3 years later, disillusioned with his superiors, Bop retreated into the deep forest, keeping company with his dog Sam. In the battle years ago, they had single-handedly fought off an entire enemy company and a helicopter, killing 70 of the enemy forces, forcing them to retreat. After escaping, Bop resigned from the army, while the cowardly commander disappeared 2 weeks later. The colonel, who knew Bop was a patriot, visited Bop's cabin one day with a group of people. The colonel had something to ask, but their conversation nearly turned into an argument. The colonel threw out a box containing the highest honor he had received, a medal of distinction. Bop was very familiar with it, as his father had once possessed one. Perhaps because of their shared experiences, the colonel asked for 5 minutes to talk. It turned out that they had just decrypted an anonymous code. Within 2 weeks, someone would attempt to assassinate the president. During this period, the president would appear in public 3 times, in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Washington. According to intelligence, the assassin claimed they would kill the president from a distance of 1 mile. Bop was an excellent sniper. The colonel wanted Bop to plan an assassination attempt on the president, using this as a way to find the enemy's position. Bop explained to the colonel that a sniper must calculate many factors: humidity, altitude, temperature, wind speed, dust. Everything needs to be factored in. The time the bullet takes to travel should be between 6 to 10 seconds at that distance. One must even account for the Earth's rotation. Moreover, the president will be wearing a bulletproof vest, so only a shot to the head could complete the mission. If they truly believed the enemy had such capability, then the situation was serious. That was exactly why the colonel turned to Bop, hoping to use the instincts of an experienced sniper to identify the assassin. Bop had no goodwill towards the current president, but the colonel knew he was a patriot. However, his faith had crumbled. The colonel didn't pressure Bop, but on the way back, he was convinced that Bop had agreed. Sitting on a high hill with his close friend, Bop began to have inner turmoil. He took his rifle and placed a metal can a mile away. At such a distance, even Bop had never tried it before. A mile was over 1,600 meters. He believed the president wouldn't need to worry. Then he loaded the rifle, took aim, and calculated the environmental conditions. After about 6 to 8 seconds, the can exploded. It seemed he needed to be more cautious. Bop had a habit of changing the firing pin every time he used his rifle. This way, no one could use his rifle. He then said goodbye to his close friend Sam, entrusted him to the pet care company for the coming days, and boarded a plane, with Washington as his first destination. He observed the location of the president's speech, looking for suitable sniper positions. The next stop was Baltimore, but the strong wind made it unsuitable for a shot. He then went to Philadelphia, where there were tall buildings. Finally, Bop arrived at the colonel's location. He believed that out of the 3 cities, only Philadelphia had a high chance of success. Baltimore had few tall buildings and strong winds, while Washington would definitely be a suicide assassination. Only in Philadelphia could the assassination be carried out from a distance of 1,800 meters. There were 6 potential positions, and the bullet's flight time would be around 5 to 6 seconds. He could wait for the president to begin his speech before taking action. The colonel was extremely grateful to Bop. He was determined to catch the mastermind, or the assassination would repeat itself. Thanks to Bop's excellent analysis, the colonel hoped he could be an observer for the operation. He had to ensure the mission's success. Bop was a patriot and was convinced by the colonel, who wore the same medal as his father. Bop left with his cool demeanor, and this was the day of the president's speech in Philadelphia. The colonel organized 6 teams of 3 people, with each team hiding at a suitable sniper position. A chubby police officer appeared, and the colonel introduced him to Bop. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Have you secured your weapon?" the police officer asked. The current speaker was the Archbishop of Ethiopia, who had just been awarded a medal. Next, the president would give his speech. The colonel ordered his subordinates to be ready. Bob focused intently, calculating the wind speed at 3 miles per hour and adjusting the angle by 4.5 minutes. If there was no wind, he would keep it unchanged. He immersed himself in his role, imagining how he would act as an assassin. He loaded his rifle and accounted for factors like altitude, humidity, and temperature. At that moment, the wind speed was just right. He was confident that within 10 seconds, the assassin would strike. He ordered the teams to act immediately. 2 gunshots rang out. Bob was hit, and at the same time, someone shot at the president. Bob leaped through a window, and the chubby police officer stuck half of his body outside to continue shooting. The scene became chaotic. They thought the president had been shot, but it turned out to be the colonel's plan. He had staged everything and framed Bob for the assassination. They had searched Bob's cabin, stolen his rifle, and deliberately staged the crime scene. Bob quickly fled. On his way, he encountered a young federal agent, but this rookie was no match for a veteran like Bob. "I didn't assassinate the president," Bob told him. The chubby police officer, Timmons, was a trap. Soon, the chubby officer ran to report to the agent that he had shot the assassin twice. Bob took control of the agent's car and fled, with the police chasing him. Helicopters and police cars scoured the area, and the chubby officer described Bob's appearance as the agent's driver. Bob drove to an automatic car wash, where he hid, and in the second lane, he was sure there was a first aid kit in the agent's trunk. He quickly stopped the bleeding and bandaged himself. Soon, the car was spotted in the streets of Philadelphia, and a tense chase ensued with police cars from the opposite direction. Bob floored the accelerator, reversing the car at high speed, and amidst the heavy gunfire, he drove straight into a fast-moving river. The police divers searched for a long time, but they only found the black car and no sign of him. Concluding that there was no body, the commander immediately ordered a 30-mile riverbank blockade. Meanwhile, Bob hid in the corner of a drifting ship, but his wound became infected after exposure to the water. Once on land, he stole a nearby car and almost escaped the police perimeter. However, the chubby officer shot him, wounding Bob. He reported to the agent with a smug look on his face. The federal agent, who had been knocked out by Bob, was then beaten and had his car stolen. He became the laughingstock of the special forces, but he wasn't embarrassed. After all, his opponent was a former Marine sniper, and he had only been on the job for 3 weeks. He kept wondering why Bob had told him he didn't assassinate the president and mentioned that Timmons was a trap. He always felt that the situation was more complicated than it seemed. Bob went to a grocery store, where the news was announcing a nationwide manhunt for him. He approached a trash can to find something useful, then cut the store's power line. This way, the staff wouldn't recognize him. He bought some bottles of saline and a syringe, then removed the X-tube from the car and found a quiet restroom. Using the saline, he treated his wound and performed a makeshift foredrip. After changing clothes, he continued on his journey. On the day of the assassination, the one who was shot was not the president, but the Archbishop of Ethiopia. Nick, the agent, watched the video of the event over and over again. Bob went to Kentucky to visit the wife of his late best friend, Donnie. Sarah had seen Bob's photo before. At first, she was going to shut the door, but then she opened it. Bob told Sarah that he hadn't assassinated the president. Sarah knew because the person who had been shot was the Archbishop of Ethiopia. Bob had nowhere else to go, and his wound was becoming unbearable. He could only ask Sarah for help. He told her that if she wanted to shoot him, she could, but if she didn't help him, he wouldn't survive the night. He had nowhere else to go. Sarah told him to drive into the garage, and then go inside to call for help. But before she could say anything, the line was cut. At that moment, the phone rang. "Hello, this is 911. We just received your call, but it was immediately disconnected." Sarah apologized, explaining that her neighbor's dog had knocked over the trash can, which startled her. "It's fine now, thank you." Sarah, kind-hearted, decided to help her late husband's friend. 3 years after Donnie's death, Bob still sent letters and flowers to Sarah every year. Bob provided a list of things for Sarah to buy at different pharmacies. Meanwhile, Agent Nick stayed up all night. He was sure that the assassination was a plot, as the first bullet trajectory map had been sent to the FBI. Just 22 minutes after the gunshots rang out, no matter how accurate the shot was, it couldn't have happened that quickly. Moreover, he had reviewed Bob's file, so he was almost certain there would be no mistakes. Also, from the flag in the video, it was clear there was almost no wind at that moment. How could an experienced sniper miss by 2.5 feet at a distance of 2,000 yards? There was also the report from the chubby police officer. Everything seemed suspicious. He decided to track down the chubby officer to get to the bottom of it. However, his female colleague informed him that the chubby officer had been shot dead in a dark alley the previous night. Bob had ingested some mysterious liquid and fell unconscious. He asked Sarah to remove the bullet fragments for him. Sarah, though just an elementary school teacher, successfully performed the surgery. After some time, Bob regained consciousness. Sarah then told him some bad news: his dog, Sam, had died. She asked him what he planned to do next. Bob replied, "I'll be fine. I'm going to burn down the backyard." Meanwhile, Nick continued his investigation. He knew this was a conspiracy and kept searching for evidence. Under Sarah's care, Bob slowly recovered. That day, Bob prepared to act. Sarah took out the rifle that Donnie had once used during training and handed it to Bob, hoping it would be useful. Bob asked Sarah for help with something, and she immediately agreed, even before he spoke. Perhaps because Bob was Donnie's teammate, she trusted him deeply. He told her to meet with the federal agent, use him to draw the colonel out into the open. "Have you ever seen this before?" he asked. He says he didn't kill anyone, but I'm not sure. Sarah handed him the colonel's car identification number and left, appearing calm on the outside, though she was deeply anxious. When the colonel arrived at the cabin to meet Bob, Bob had already gathered information about the car. Two police officers, noticing Bob looked suspicious, asked him to remove his hat for inspection. A scuffle ensued, and within moments, both officers were taken down. Bob removed his jacket and left. Nick continued investigating the car's identification number, but the information was restricted and required special permission to access. He went to a black colleague for help, as she was the only one who trusted him at that point. She also thought that the young agent was very courageous, daring to investigate the case despite the risk of being fired or arrested. She told him who had the colonel's authorization. The colonel had noticed Nick. He had just requested access to the colonel's vehicle information and had been spotted near a bakery a few minutes ago. A police officer had seen a man resembling Bob there. So, the colonel began to act. Nick was talking to his black colleague when suddenly a car sped toward him and three burly men got out, forcing him into the car to a secluded place. They started interrogating him, but instead of asking questions, they attached some strange device to his gun that Nick had never seen before. He had never seen a federal agent in such a miserable state. The leader, a bald man, placed the gun in Nick's hand. This was a machine capable of creating a fake crime scene. Nick gave up at that moment. A man was shot dead instantly, and the bald man panicked and hid behind Nick. However, he did not escape his fate, as he was soon killed. Another man entered the room, only to discover his two dead comrades on the floor. Bob appeared. It turned out this was his trap. He had intentionally contacted Nick and appeared before the police to use him as bait to draw the colonel out. Nick had already uncovered a lot of information and advised Bob to find a good lawyer to defend him legally. Bob seemed to have already realized the situation. "That man killed my dog," he said. He didn't want to hear any more meaningless words. He asked the federal agent, "Are you going to act or not?" The poor agent responded, "I should have been fired in the meeting today, but thanks to these guys abducting me, I'm still here. I'll cherish this opportunity." The three henchmen were killed, and the man in the wheelchair was shot with a sniper rifle from 200 yards. Bob was still alive. Then they found Bob's spending history. Every year, he sent flowers to someone, Sarah, Donnie's wife, the woman he had once protected. Now both Bob and Nick were forced to join forces. They traveled to Tennessee to meet an expert sniper. Bob wanted to find someone capable of shooting from a distance of 2,200 yards. The old man mentioned 3 snipers. One was in El Paso, currently in prison, another was dead, and the third was a ruthless assassin who had killed hundreds of people. However, his enemies also wanted to kill him. They eventually found him in an abandoned 6-story building, where they used artillery to flatten the building. Some said he managed to crawl out. Bob's intuition told him that he had met this person before. The old man grabbed Bob's hand and seemed to realize who he was. Nick called his female boss and asked for her help investigating a certain person, the ruthless sniper, Miller. The colonel also knew that Bob would try everything to uncover information about that sniper. So, he decided to use Miller as bait to lure Bob out. Nick's female colleague found out Miller's information. Late one night, Nick received a call. They had Miller's address. Sarah was getting ready to sleep when she suddenly heard a strange noise. She grabbed Donnie's pistol, and soon, the colonel's men found her house. Another one of his men took Sarah hostage. Meanwhile, Bob and Nick arrived at Miller's mansion in the woods. Bob realized it was a trap. The two started shopping for supplies according to Bob's list, making Molotov cocktails, smoke bombs, and homemade grenades. Though homemade, these weapons would certainly be effective. They repainted the rifle to match the color from the crime scene and began training Nick. Bob needed Nick to stay focused and not be distracted by anything. "I told you not to let anything distract you," Bob insisted as he continued the training. Nick became the lookout, watching for any movements outside the mansion while Bob slowly moved in, taking down guards and planting bombs. One by one, Bob neutralized the guards and placed more bombs. Soon, only one guard was left outside the mansion. As he went on his patrol, Bob managed to handle most of the others. After throwing another bomb, Bob switched to a handgun. Nick spotted someone on the rooftop, which allowed Bob to infiltrate and face Miller. Miller admitted everything. He said that the colonel had come to him, just as he had come to Bob, using them both as expendable pawns. The real target of the assassination wasn't the president, it was the Archbishop of Ethiopia. By making it look like an assassination attempt on the president, everyone would think it was a failed plot. The plan was designed to provoke people into fighting over an oil pipeline, causing local communities to rebel. Then they would just shoot them instead of negotiating. The Archbishop wanted to expose this dark secret. At that moment, the mansion was surrounded by soldiers. Miller spoke about an oil pumping station in Africa where over 400 bodies were buried. These crimes were the result of contractors whom Bob had once protected when he worked in Africa. In that mission, they had no intention of letting Bob survive. The colonel had received orders from a senator. They weren't the masterminds acting alone, but part of a larger corporate conspiracy. Nick realized the situation and urgently informed Bob. Miller confirmed that everything he said was true, because lying wouldn't help him anymore. He grabbed a handgun and pointed it at Bob, telling him that Sarah was in their hands. Miller knew his value, as leverage was gone. Even if he helped the colonel capture Bob, he would die in the mansion anyway. Bob, surrounded by dozens of soldiers, was slowly closing in on his enemies. He used his sniper skills to evade them, eventually taking down 2 soldiers and charging into the room to confront Nick. When Bob saw that the soldiers were about to surround the mansion, he quickly moved to position 2. He ordered Nick to activate the smoke bombs, followed by tear gas bombs. In the thick smoke that he had created, Bop began firing while running out of the mansion. He sprinted as fast as he could, detonating Molotov cocktails. Huge flames erupted, engulfing a large area, followed by a series of explosions from the bombs he had planted. Bop escaped the encirclement, but a helicopter appeared, circling above, watching them. Bop suddenly thought of Donnie. He couldn't let Nick suffer the same fate as Donnie. They quickly took cover behind a warehouse, and Bop decided to shoot down the helicopter. Only then could they escape unharmed. He observed the position of the fuel tank and the helicopter. Nick distracted the enemies, and Bop used a sniper rifle to provide cover. When the helicopter reached the designated spot, Bop fired, hitting the fuel tank and causing an explosion. The flames shot up and consumed the helicopter. They ran into the forest, disappearing from the sight of the federal agents. The news of the gunfight spread. Shell casings littered the ground, the helicopter burned, and bodies were scattered. However, the fingerprints collected from the shell casings indicated that one group belonged to Bop, and the other belonged to the federal agents. Nick and the old men began to realize their mistake. They had underestimated Bop. However, they still had one trump card left, Sarah. At that moment, Sarah was being kidnapped and tortured. Nick called his female boss, who transferred him to the FBI director. Nick said he had captured Bop, but he couldn't bring him in because he didn't know who to trust anymore. After hanging up, Bop received a call from the colonel. The colonel talked about Sarah's kidnapping. Bop played a recording of a mass grave at the border of Arikia, where over 400 corpses were buried. This was the crime of the colonel and his associates, which Miller had revealed. They all had leverage over each other, so they decided to negotiate, but the exchange required one more person, the senator from Montana. The colonel obviously disagreed, but Bop revealed the location of the grave, and the colonel had no choice but to agree. They chose a secluded place for the exchange, a snowy mountain peak. The senator arrived in a small red plane, confident because they had already prepared all the necessary precautions. As Bop slowly walked forward, he was suddenly shot by a sniper. However, it wasn't Bop, it was Nick. Bop continued searching for the target, and with another shot, he killed 3 of the colonel's snipers. Nick slowly stood up, pulled off his bulletproof vest, and discarded the steel plate. "It's not over yet," Bop said as he aimed at the man holding Sarah hostage and fired another shot. The FBI director received a letter from Nick and immediately took action. Sarah grabbed the senator's handgun and aimed it at the agent. After exchanging a few words with the senator, Nick realized it was impossible to overthrow him. Their power was too great. Federal agents stormed the place, and Bop immediately destroyed the recording device because he knew that if he handed it over to the government, everyone who had come into contact with him would be killed. The senator left calmly, confident that no one would dare to touch him. Next, it was the colonel's turn. They reached a deal, and Bop surrendered, so he was arrested. In court, they removed the handcuffs from Bop. He admitted that the gun was his and that the bullets were his as well. He confirmed that after the federal agents had taken possession of the gun, no one had touched it. He loaded a bullet into the chamber and pulled the trigger, but the gun didn't fire. This was because Bop always replaced the firing pins when he left the house, making the gun incapable of firing. He proved that the bullet could not have been fired from his weapon. The colonel thought Bop's explanation was clever but irrelevant. There was no evidence to accuse him. The colonel was about to leave when Nick revealed the colonel's crimes and the brutal events, but it wasn't in Africa. This happened in another country, beyond the jurisdiction of the prosecutor. He had no authority to try the colonel, and the colonel arrogantly walked away. The prosecutor stood up and walked over to Bop. He didn't like the outcome either, but that was the world they lived in. Justice wasn't always served. This wasn't the Wild West, where you could solve problems with a gun, though sometimes it was necessary. The prosecutor told Bop that he was free now. Back at the mansion in the forest, the colonel, the senator, and their associates were celebrating. No one could punish them. Even the prosecutor was powerless. But the senator wanted the colonel to leave the next day for Ecuador, to lay low for a while until the situation calmed down. Just then, a body fell from above. Bop had arrived. The colonel stood up, only to be shot dead on the spot. The secretary was terrified and stepped aside. Then, their car exploded. The prosecutor was right. Sometimes, justice needed to be protected with a gun. Bop stormed into the mansion, taking down the secretary, who was begging for mercy. The senator shouted for him to stop, declaring, "I'm a U.S. senator." But Bop opened the gas valve and walked out of the mansion. After walking a short distance, there was a deafening explosion behind him. He didn't look back. Bop crossed through the forest, where a car was waiting for him. It was Sarah. She looked at the man before her, knowing that he had finished what he set out to do. They got in the car and drove off, heading back home to start a new life. The story ends here. Thank you for watching the film. What do you think of the movie? Feel free to comment below.